which introduces us in these chapters to a couple of things. One of the things that they bring out is the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Now, you may have heard the term orthodox before, right? Something being orthodox. And so when people talk about a teaching or a belief being orthodox, what do they mean? They say that's an orthodox belief.
Accepted by the church.
Okay, accepted by the church.
Original, common.
Okay. What else? When you hear the term orthodox, what does it mean?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I think all of these are kind of getting at it, right? That when we talk about orthodox, we're talking about beliefs or teachings, right? And so the idea behind something being orthodox is it's that correct teaching, it's that right teaching, it's the thing that's accepted. And so orthodox tends to focus on beliefs and teachings. Orthopraxy is probably not one that you may have come across, but it's not one that gets used that often. But essentially the idea behind orthopraxy is that the practices or the things done are correct. Right? So this has to do with correct teaching, orthodoxy. Orthopraxy has to do with correct practices or correct action. Which is more important, would you say, in Christianity? Orthodoxy. Why would you say orthodoxy?
Because if you practice it, doesn't mean you believe it, it doesn't mean you just do something to do it. If you believe in it, you can teach another person about it, which is creating more. So it's all about teaching one and reaching one.
Okay, so from an evangelistic standpoint, orthodoxy, you have the right teaching. Other thoughts? Either people that would agree with that or say, no, it's better to have the right practice.
I would say that they're equal.
Okay, so we're going to kind of split the difference here and say, right? Okay, so you're saying that if you are believing right, you're going to act right or do the right things. Is that kind of what you're,
you may not always play off each other, but you have to have both people, like faith and works deal, or if you like the Pharisees who taught right, but they didn't have the practicing correctly.
okay?
Or you're practicing living your life right, but you're teaching falsely. Either of those wouldn't be good.
Okay, all right. So to be wrong in either of these isn't really upholding the example of Christ. Other thoughts?
You can't have one without the other.
Okay.
If you're practicing it, but you don't believe in it, then it's enough of its value. It's worthless.
Okay.
If you're not believing what you're doing.
So ultimately, it seems like what I'm getting is that while both are important, it's better to have the right beliefs because that's going to shape the practice rather than having the right practice because that's going to shape the beliefs. Right? So we're kind of saying the belief is the foundation here. Right? That if you can do this without having the right knowledge, but you could just be going through the motions. All right. Anybody disagree with that statement, or is that kind of where everybody's? All right. So maybe it's important for us to see. Maybe we can come back to that another question. But I think that's probably a good place to start, and a good place to think about it is that having the right beliefs is going to lead to the right practice, but having the right practice may or may not lead to the right beliefs. Right? And that sometimes by splitting these two, we might end up like the Pharisees on the one hand. What they're saying is true, but what they're living is not true. Or we can live in a certain way as outsiders, and they say, "Oh, well, he's doing all the right things," but inside they aren't doing, or they don't really believe the things they're saying or doing, those kind of things. All right, so that might be part of it. So another important concept that Stone and Duke bring out that I think are very important things for us to consider as we think through their work, right, reading through that book, but then also thinking about some of the things that we're talking about this semester, has to do with the difference between what they term embedded theology and deliberative theology. All right, so we'll go ahead and put the other one up there. Embedded theology and deliberative theology. Now again, if you haven't gone to this chapter yet, you might not have encountered these terms, but when you see the term embedded theology, what do you think they mean by that term?
I think it's like a theology that you're taught, but that you don't necessarily know where it comes from. And when I think about one of the examples that I like to pick on sometimes is like what's the given name for Satan in the Bible? Most people will tell you Lucifer. Where does that come from? When is Lucifer used in the Bible? In what context does it? Most people couldn't tell you.
All right, so the theology that we're kind of either given or we accept or assimilate, that's largely what they're talking about, right? Is that for most of us as Christians, there are certain ideas, beliefs that we have that we've grown up believing, we've accepted because the minister said it or our parents have said it, but it's just kind of a part of our belief system, and sometimes we don't know why. Right? We have an answer to questions, but we're not sure why that's the answer or why that's the case. So let's try a little bit of an exercise right now. Let's think about the church, right? A theological concept, the church. When you think about the church, what are some ideas that you know from these are the things you think about with the church? Right? Concepts, ideas, beliefs about the church. If I say somebody, is like, give you an essay exam right now. Tell me about the church. That's the question. What do you write? What do you tell me?
Like what the church should be or what it is?
You can go either route. When you think about, let's say I'm giving you a question. That's the only question on it. What is the church? How would you answer that?
Group of believers.
All right, group of believers. The body. Okay, so talk about the origins. What else would you say if you were giving this exam? What is the church?
It kind of depends on what church. The church of Christ Army, but we individuals act a completely different way.
Okay.
I would say that
Okay. What else would you say? What is the church?
As a whole, I guess it's just every believer.
Okay, so that's kind of suggesting there's different manifestations of the church, right? You have a group of believers, but then also the kind of universal church, those that are alive, those that have died. What else?
I think a lot of times living in church is like a ceremonial meeting or some kind of like activity we do, but it's not really the church. Like, we are the church, the people are the church, and we get so caught up in these like denominations and all these things, but that's not the church really. It's the people, the Holy Spirit in us, and that's really the church. It's not that all this, an activity and stuff and something we have to do. It's just who we are.
Okay. So we've had some different answers. One is there's the group of believers. There's the image of the body that was used. Talk about the origin, recognition of different groups within a religious name, as well as groups that are by different names. There's discussion of what we might call the local church, the universal church, the difference between things done by the church versus identity. Some of those are quite different. Would we say that they're all valid, though? I mean, they're all, that if you were grading the exam and you saw those answers, would you give full credit? Why not? Okay, all right. We could certainly say, well, if we wanted to give a full answer, we'd have to use more images. The church is the bride of Christ, and some variety of other things we could certainly come up with more. So, where did you get those ideas about the church? Okay. Okay. So some of it might come from our own personal type of activity, meaning our personal experience, what other people have told us, and then our own personal study. But probably there were some things that we just kind of came to our mind. Right? Early Monday morning, we may not feel like speaking out, but there was probably something that came to our mind. All right? Those are the things that largely, are probably what would fit under embedded theology. Right? These are the things that we have as a part of us that might be from just growing up within a church, listening to sermons about church, going to Bible study, talking about the church. But how much of what you thought of? All right, so this is the first question. You don't have to answer this, right? It's rhetorical. It's meant to make you think, not necessarily answer. How much of what you thought of, whether you spoke up or not, how much of what you thought of would you say, I came to that idea through a personal study of the church, or through any sort of directed study of the church, that you can pinpoint and say, these are the things that I've spent some time, I want to know what the church is, and so I answered those questions. Probably for most of us, we'd say, well, some of it is my own thinking and maybe study, reading the Bible, but probably a good part of it is things that we grew up thinking and hearing, things that we take for granted because of our experiences. So there's some things that are embedded in our theology. That can be absolutely fine. All the things that we were saying today, it's a group of believers, it's the body. We think about when it started and how it started, what it was started before. Thinking about this idea of belief and action and consistency, and it's about what we do, but it's also about who we are. Right? All of those are true, and I think there's good scriptural evidence that we could look at that would say, right, this is what the church is to be about. But we tend to probably think, we accept certain things uncritically. We don't think through when it comes to the church. So what was deliberative theology then? Right? Embedded theology is the kind of things we take for granted. We've assimilated through growing up or other people, listening to other people, or the things we take for granted. What would deliberative theology be, do you think? Okay, so engaging in kind of a critical reflection. So some things we accept, other things, and perhaps this is the one we need to do more of, is critically reflect on our ideas or ideas that we hear about the church. So thinking about deliberative theology, we see it as being something that is more intentional, where embedded theology is more passive. Go here.
What do you mean? So, for example, like you're taught something at a young age, then eventually you do your deliberative thought process or something. Is that in a different category, or would you just call that deliberative after that? Like, I feel like that's something that people do all the time and stuff, but I just don't know if there's a name for that or just a different category.
Yeah, the idea behind deliberative theology would be taking an active role in investigating an issue, right? And so you might have certain ideas about the church because that's what you grew up with. They could be right, but deliberative theology would be, now I have these ideas about the church. Are they right? Right? And going through that process of thinking about that. And so, that, you could be reflecting on things that So that would be one way to think about deliberative theology. Another way would be, let's say you're part of a committee or the elders call some people together and say, we're thinking of starting this ministry for whatever, let's say the homeless. We want to start a homeless ministry. Deliberative theology would be that group together talking about things like, well, is that fulfilling the mission of the church? What is the mission of the church and how does this fulfill it? Is the things that we're saying we're going to do, is it in line with showing Jesus, or would we end up, just feeding the homeless but not sharing the gospel? Right? So that would be another way that deliberative theology would work. So it could be just kind of questioning what you believe, investigating what you believe, or it could be facing an issue that comes up. But to do this, we have to do deliberative theology, we have to intentionally do deliberative theology. Why might it be a challenge to engage in theology or theologizing? Theologizing? Thinking theologically, let's go that route. Why would it be a challenge?
Theology is a very complicated.
Okay. All right. It could be, if you're thinking about a particular issue that comes up, there could be a lot of things to think about. It could be a complicated process. What else?
You did your investigation, then eventually you went to somebody else to try to talk to them about it and get their perspective on things. Like in some instances, they could have a completely different view. As you kind of like that, it's difficult.
they got to put a different view that can shape what you just studied for a month, like however long you studied up on it. And they might have a view that you didn't come up with. I mean, that's just maybe aggravating, or maybe just like it's like what you did wasn't worth it because you're trying to help other people with business, and you end up seeing it shut down or something like that. And other people, their way is not wrong, neither is yours. So that's the way it's kind of hard to do.
Yeah, there's kind of that process of interacting with someone after you've done this. You know, is it going to be received or is it going to be rejected? And, you know, will I end up feeling like this has been a waste of time? Other things that might be a challenge.
I think for me, the one that I think of is, as a Christian, how should we approach certain subjects? You know, and do we come to it with a completely unbiased, let's just look at it and figure it out kind of way? As Christians, should we do that? You know, in some cases, you know, if we look at it just in a completely Christian, God has an answer for this kind of way. Sometimes there may not be a theological answer for a problem that comes up. Maybe sometimes it's a textual answer for a problem that comes up that we may miss if we're not looking at it in an unbiased way. But you know, it's kind of how should I approach these problems as a Christian?
Yeah, and so there could be the question: how do I get started? What, you know, and bringing bias. Not biased necessarily in a negative way, but you know, if I'm coming to it from a specific situation or a specific religious background. And how much of that can I retain? How much of that should I abandon in favor of trying to make sure I don't miss something? David?
There's similar, like if you go into it, if you go into intentionally, deliberatively studying the Bible, like you go into it with and that is theology that's not necessarily true. It may be difficult shaping that, or you go into it with that mindset and it changes how you perceive the Bible.
Yeah, so if you don't start with that recognition of, I mean, you might not cognitively understand all the things that are embedded in your theology, but if you don't start with, okay, there might be some things here that I've just grown to accept that may not be true. And so if you don't start with that awareness, that could skew what you're doing. That gets a little bit to what Zach was saying about with bias. And then other things that I think of that are challenges as well are the practical things, like taking the time to do that, right? Because, you know, we don't have other things we need to do, right? And so sometimes we just, the pressure of time with all our other responsibilities, you know, it's just a lot easier just to accept some things than to take the time. And especially if it's in a situation where we're with a group of people and so we got to communicate and work through, and it's just somebody make the decision and let's just move forward. So it's the ease of some of those things, the time, the effort, right? So sometimes those practical things can get in the way. But you know, when it comes to it, if we want to live consistent with our Christian calling, our Christian mission, sometimes we have to take the time to do some theological thinking, right? And not just accept some things that we've been taught. Because we could have been taught wrong, or we could have misunderstood, and all sorts of other kind of things could happen that would skew our embedded theology, perhaps. Or, you know, if we're trying to work together collaboratively to come to an agreement about some topic or some mission, we might end up in conflict instead of trying to say, okay, you know, where am I coming from, and recognizing, all right, somebody else might be coming from some other position, all right, maybe we need to talk about some other things first, like what is the mission of the church, or what is it that we're called to be in the world. Student youth, of course, will move towards, all right, now that we have these ideas, how do we then move forward in making theological distinctions? And we'll try to hit that either on Wednesday or next week in those second and third chapters.